I got it wrong once. Spent years believing that earthquake-resistant building was a modern breakthrough, a gift from contemporary engineering passed backward through time to a few clever cultures. Then a colleague handed me a photograph of a centuries-old Filipino house, still standing, and said nothing. Didn't need to. The wood spoke for itself. Let me tell you what the wood said. Before steel, before seismographs, before any laboratory measured the rage of shifting tectonic plates, people in the Philippine archipelago were already building structures that could dance with the earth instead of fighting it. Not temples of stone meant to endure through sheer mass. Something more elegant, more humble, and arguably more brilliant. But the story of how that brilliance was overlooked, borrowed, rediscovered, and debated, that doesn't begin with a king or a conqueror. No famous architect gets the credit here. The real thread of the tale belongs to nameless carpenters, to hands roughened by adze and bamboo, to workers whose ingenuity lived in muscle memory passed down through uncounted generations. So here's the argument that keeps surfacing in cultural history circles. Let's say one side says ancient Filipinos pioneered earthquake-proof architecture thousands of years ago, long before the more celebrated seismic-resistant traditions of Japan gained global recognition. The opposing side argues that comparison itself is misleading, that different cultures independently solved different problems, and framing it as copying distorts both histories. Both sides have real weight. Let's start with what the first camp brings to the table. The Bahay Kubo, a phrase most Filipinos learn as children, usually in a folk song. Few realize they're singing about one of the most seismically intelligent designs the ancient world ever produced. Elevated on stilts, framed with flexible bamboo, lashed together without nails, roofed with nipa palm. Every element chosen not for decoration, but for survival. Bamboo bends, doesn't shatter. When an earthquake rolls through, a rigid structure fights the lateral force. Concrete cracks, brick collapses. Masonry fails at the joints. Bamboo and timber framing absorbs that force, flexes, redistributes energy through the whole skeleton of the building. You know, the Bahay Kubo doesn't resist the earthquake. The Bahay Kubo agrees with it, moves alongside it, sways like a tree in a typhoon, then settles back. Archaeological evidence from sites across the Philippine archipelago shows post-hole patterns dating back roughly 3,000 years, consistent with stilt-raised timber and bamboo construction. The Austronesian peoples who settled the islands brought with them seafaring knowledge, sophisticated woodworking, and an intimate understanding of natural forces. Tidal surges, monsoon winds, volcanic tremors. Building had to account for all of these simultaneously. Imagine being the carpenter, not a chief, not a datu presiding over a ceremony, a person whose name no oral epic preserved, whose face no Spanish chronicler sketched. Crouching in the shade, splitting bamboo with a blade, knowing by feel when the fibers were right, knowing which joints to leave loose so the frame could breathe, knowing how high to raise the floor so floodwater passed beneath without stealing the home. That knowledge was architecture, profound, tested, refined over centuries. But because no one carved it into stone monuments or painted it on palace walls, colonial historians walked right past it. Now here's where things get complicated, because a similar and yet distinct tradition exists across the water in Japan. The question of whether one influenced the other carries a tension that hasn't fully resolved. Japan's celebrated wooden pagodas, particularly structures like the 5-story pagoda at Horyuji Temple, have survived earthquakes for over a millennium. The engineering is remarkable. Layered floors that sway independently, a central pillar called a shinbashira that acts almost like a suspended spine, allowing the building to snake back and forth rather than topple. Modern engineers have studied these pagodas extensively, confirming that the design principles are genuinely earthquake-resistant. Stop. Does that mean Japan copied Filipino techniques? Here's where intellectual honesty matters more than cultural pride. Direct evidence of transmission, a documented moment where Japanese builders studied Filipino construction and adopted its principles, doesn't exist in the historical record. Not yet, at least. Maritime trade routes between Southeast Asia and Japan are well established for the later centuries, but pinning architectural influence to a specific exchange requires more than proximity. What can be said with confidence is this: Filipino seismic architecture predates the earliest known Japanese wooden pagoda construction by a significant margin. The Baha'i Kubo's design philosophy, flexibility over rigidity, bamboo over stone, movement over resistance, was already ancient when Japan's temple building traditions were still taking shape. Priority of invention matters, so does independent genius. Both things can be true at the same time, and a quiet detail about Japanese pagoda research reveals something striking, a thread worth following later. Some modern structural engineers studying the Shinbashira principle have noted that the closest natural analog to its behavior isn't found in Japanese vernacular housing at all, but in the flexible post and beam traditions of tropical Southeast Asian building. Curious coincidence. Or maybe not a coincidence. We'll come back to that. Now for the second argument, the pushback, and it deserves fair hearing. Critics of the Filipinos did it first. Narrative raised several solid points. First, earthquake-resistant building evolved independently in multiple seismic zones worldwide. The Incas fitted stones without mortar at Sacsayhuaman. You know, Kashmiri builders developed tack construction, alternating timber and masonry layers. Cultures living on fault lines tend to develop flexible building. Parallel evolution doesn't require a single origin. Second, comparing a bamboo dwelling to a multi-story wooden pagoda involves a category difference. Scale, material complexity, ceremonial function. These distinctions matter. Saying Japan copied Filipino architecture oversimplifies radically. A raised bamboo hut and a towering temple serve different purposes, face different structural challenges, and reflect different societal organizations. Well, third, the word copied carries a political charge. Post-colonial pride, absolutely justified, can sometimes lead to overclaiming, which then invites dismissal from mainstream academia. When the framing sounds like a contest rather than a conversation, the real achievement gets lost in the argument about it. Let's say these criticisms aren't dismissals, they're calibrations. And some of them are right. But here's what they miss. Dismissing the Baha'i Kubo as simple because it's small, because it uses bamboo, because a single family could build one in days. That reveals a bias, not a fact. Simplicity of form doesn't equal simplicity of thought. The engineering principles embedded in that structure, base isolation through elevated posts, energy dissipation through flexible joints, lightweight roofing to reduce gravitational load during shaking, these are the same principles that modern seismic engineering rediscovered in the 20th century using computers and shake tables. A carpenter who never heard the word resonance built against it anyway. Consider the mortise and tenon joints used in some Filipino wooden houses documented during the Spanish colonial period. No nails, no adhesive. Wood fitted into wood with enough tolerance to allow micro-movement. When the ground shook, those joints absorbed the vibration. When the shaking stopped, the joints settled back. Engineers today call this ductile connection design. Filipino carpenters 3,000 years ago called it common sense. And here's the thing about common sense. Someone had to invent it first. Picture the unnamed builder again. Calloused hands, sweat-streaked face, no blueprint, no formula, no patron funding a grand commission. Working from inherited knowledge and personal observation. Watching a bamboo grove survive a typhoon while a stone wall crumbled. Taking note, applying the lesson, passing it to an apprentice without writing a single word down. That's how invisible genius works, not through fame, through repetition, through survival. The Spanish colonial era nearly erased this tradition. Stone churches rose across the islands, European-style, thick-walled, monumental. Earthquakes brought them down repeatedly. The Great Manila Earthquake of 1645 destroyed numerous colonial stone buildings. The earthquake of 1880 did the same. Meanwhile, indigenous structures in the provinces, the bamboo homes, the timber longhouses, survived. Colonial administrators noted this with puzzlement, sometimes with grudging admiration, rarely with the conclusion that indigenous builders knew something they didn't. One Spanish-era account describes a friar marveling that native houses seemed to float upon the ground during tremors. Floating. The friar saw magic where there was engineering. That blindness persisted for centuries, and in some academic circles, it persists still. Now, return to that unfinished thread about the Shinbashira. Modern Japanese engineers studying pagoda resilience have acknowledged that the flexible frame principle transcends any single culture. Some researchers working in seismic engineering have drawn explicit parallels between the bamboo construction of Southeast Asia and the timber frame flexibility of Japanese traditional buildings. No one credible claims direct copying, but influence through maritime contact remains a legitimate hypothesis, one that archaeological and anthropological research continues to explore. The Austronesian expansion, one of the greatest migrations in human history, carried building techniques across thousands of miles of ocean. From Taiwan through the Philippines to Indonesia, Melanesia, Polynesia, and even Madagascar. Architectural DNA traveled with human DNA. If building knowledge could reach Madagascar, could it not have reached Japan through the Ryukyu island chain, through centuries of sporadic contact? No definitive proof exists. But the question remains open, and the directional timeline is clear. Filipino flexible frame construction is older. Japanese flexible frame construction is younger. Draw your own line or leave it blank. Either way, the Filipino carpenter came first. Now, if you want to know which side of the argument holds up when you strip away the politics, the pride, and the counter-pride, stay here, because the answer isn't what either camp expects. The real conclusion doesn't live in competition. Framing ancient Filipino ingenuity as a weapon against Japan diminishes both cultures. What elevates both is recognizing a shared human instinct. When the ground tries to kill you, you learn to move with it, not against it. Filipino builders discovered that truth early, remarkably early. Japanese builders discovered a version of it later, applied it at scale, and refined it into forms that rightly earned global respect. But the seed, well, the first expression. The quiet, unglamorous, unheroic act of choosing bamboo over stone, choosing flexibility over force, choosing survival over monument, that happened in the islands of the Philippines, in the hands of people whose names were never written anywhere. Not kings, not priests, carpenters. A carpenter watches the earth tremble, feels the floor shift, sees the walls hold, nods once, goes back to splitting bamboo. No monument marks the spot. No textbook credits the mind. Somewhere in the soil of an island province, post holes remain, faint circles in the clay, evidence that someone, long before recorded history, solved a problem modern science took centuries to understand. And the house they built is gone, but the idea inside it survived every earthquake since. Some things don't need stone to last.